Welcome everybody to this session. I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker, Dr. Nikolai Morar, whose presentation is entitled Desire and Pleasure, Deleuze and Foucault's Reading of Wilhelm Reich. Dr. Morar is currently an assistant professor in environmental studies and philosophy at the University of Oregon, where he also collaborates with the Institute of Ecology and Evolution and serves as a member of the Consortium for Socially Relevant Philosophy in Science and Engineering. Dr. Morar was previously a visiting scholar at the Hastings Center, where he undertook a project entitled A Critical Argument for a Principle of Minimal Biological Realism in Bioethics. He was subsequently a postdoctoral scholar at the Rock Ethics Institute at Penn State University. And he's also the co-founder of Purdue's Lectures in Ethics, Policy, and Science, as well as the co-organizer and co-editor of the project Between Deleuze and Foucault. Recent major co-edited books include Perspectives in Bioethics, Science and Public Policy, which was published in 2013, and the Foucault and Deleuze special issue of Foucault Studies in 2014. 3 forthcoming books, which he's currently co-editing, include Biopower, Foucault and Beyond, Between Foucault and Derrida, and Between Deleuze and Foucault, all of which are scheduled for 2016. He's also published numerous journal articles and book chapters, most of which I won't mention here, but which include, for example, The Pragmatics of Desire and Pleasure, Rethinking Somatic Powers with Foucault, Deleuze, and Guattari, with Marjorie Grassmus in The Care of Life, Transdisciplinary Perspectives in Bioethics and Biopolitics.
So I would like to start by thanking the organizers for their invitation. I'm very humbled to be here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm also, I think it's very difficult to follow two fantastic talks by Mellon and Joanna. I'll do my best. And although I wish I could bring a little bit more light to the relationship between Deleuze, between Foucault and Lacan, I think I will come slightly from a different perspective and trying to understand what's the relationship between Deleuze and Foucault and the Freud Marxist tradition. So I will dive in. I would like to preface this paper with 2 brief quotes and precise dates. In 1966, Deleuze writes, L'homme, une existence douteuse, a review of Foucault's Les mots et les choses, where he says, a new image of thought, a new conception of what thinking means is the task of philosophy today. To the question, what's new in philosophy? Foucault's books, all by themselves, provide a profound answer, one of the liveliest and the most penetrating. On Foucault's end, needless to say, all of us have in mind his review of Deleuze's difference in repetition and logic and sense, where he writes, quote, I believe that these words will continue to revolve about us in an enigmatic resonance with those of Klosowski, another major and excessive sign, and perhaps one day this century will be known as Deleuzian. New thought is possible, says Deleuze, thought again is possible. I could have read you multiple other quotes as evidence for the profound admiration between Foucault and Deleuze. More importantly, their admiration was not merely animated by their intellectual pursuits, but equally by an earnest friendship that one could easily witness in Deleuze's last words from his interview with Paul Rabinov in 1986, Foucault in the prison. Quote, I always had an enormous admiration and affection for Foucault. I had the feeling with no sadness that in the end I needed him. However, in spite of their friendship and high appreciation for each one's writings, they held diametrically opposed views on a series of topics like the Israeli-Palestinian question, the enthusiasm over Mitterrand's presidency, the Klaus Croissant affair, or even over their individual relationship with Le Nouveau Philosophe, or about the question of war as an epistemic paradigm for politics. Here I intend to highlight what I believe most commentators have considered as the most significant philosophical disagreement between them. The question of desire and pleasure as the very problem that has to be debated in the revival of social struggles. A certain number of interpretations regarding this conceptual divergence have been staked out so far, On one end of the spectrum, we can find those defending the incompatibility thesis. In a recent article called Faux Amis, When de Grace strongly argues that their respective philosophy are irreconcilable. Quote, Foucault's account of sexuality is incompatible with desire as formulated by Deleuze and Guattari. End of quote. Similarly, David Rabouin points out, quote, that there is no common understanding of desire between Deleuze and Foucault. And Rabouin reinforces his claim with a reference to the 1983 interview with Foucault's structuralism and post-structuralism. When asked if the similarity between his thinking and Deleuze's philosophy go as far as endorsing Deleuze's notion of desire, Foucault replies, no, precisely not. On the other end of the spectrum, we can find scholars like Marjorie Gracieuse, who in a recent working paper dismantles the oppositional character of the desire-pleasure dichotomy by showing that those notions, quote, signal a kind of a blind spot, an empty place that cannot and should not be occupied by any ultimate signifier. Desire and pleasure are purely strategic operators aimed at liberating within discourse itself a space of freedom and constant integration capable of making us think and feel differently. Personally, I have argued elsewhere that a careful reading of Foucault's La Volonté de Savoir and of Deleuze and Guattari's Anti-Oedipus would be sufficient to call into question the incompatibility thesis. However, in spite of my sympathy with Marjorie's argument, which dismantled this oppositional desire-pleasure dichotomy, I'm still not able to fully endorse her view. Foucault would probably have endorsed her view. Foucault believed, as Deleuze reports in his 1977 letter, Desire and Pleasure, that, quote, the desire and pleasure problem is merely a semantic one. So yes, the incompatibility thesis seems to fail. I continue nonetheless to believe that a certain form of divergence persists, and Deleuze reinforces my worry when he claims that his concern with the desire-pleasure problem is more profound than a question of words. Hence my question, if the desire-pleasure problem is not a matter of incompatibility, what can help us explain this conceptual divergence that seems nonetheless to persist among them? So in this paper, I defend the thesis that in order to understand this persisting conceptual divergence, one can analyze the ways in which Foucault and Deleuze, including Guattari, have been influenced by the Freudo-Marxist tradition, especially by the works of Wilhelm Reich. Didier Ribon's recent chapter in Foucault Now supports this reading when he claims, quote, the radically critical gesture performed by a certain number of theoreticians during the 70s in the face of psychoanalysis constitutes one of the most important legacy, one of the aspects of the intellectual ferment of that time that today most urgently needs to be discovered, end of quote. In order to support my thesis, I want to make three interrelated points. First, I want to tease out Deleuze and Guattari's relation to Reich. Second, I want to show Foucault's multifaceted relationship with Freudo-Marxists and highlight his radical separation with Reich's conceptual schema in La Volonté de Savoir. And in the third section, I aim to bring a little bit more nuance, but show that the limitations of a polarized interpretation with respect to Reich's writing probably are falling apart. So first section, Deleuze and Guattari, Anti-Oedipus and Reich. Reich's 1946, The Mass Psychology of Fascists, has played a central role in framing political questions surrounding the repression of sexuality. Deleuze's political writings have been influenced by this Freudo-Marxist perspective, up to the point that in Anti-Oedipus in 1972, he and Guattari claimed that Reich, after Spinoza, has discovered the fundamental problem of political philosophy. Quote, why do men fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? End of quote. Deleuze and Guattari continue that after centuries of exploitation, why do people still tolerate being humiliated and enslaved to such a point, indeed, they actually want humiliation and slavery, not only for others, but for themselves, end of quote. The task of the first volume of Capitalism and Schizophrenia is precisely to tackle this significant political question. And there's, just as a sort of parallel, there is always a question as to how Deleuze moves from the logic of sense in 1969 and to Anti-Oedipus in 1972. And often people tend to say, oh, it's Guattari's fault. The solo Deleuze, a lot of people think that it was just an elitist guy who was doing just, history of philosophy or metaphysics, and he was indifferent to politics, whereas, when Guattari comes in, that completely shifts. Deleuze's thinking. And part of that is probably true. In his interview with Negri, Control and Becoming, Deleuze says the following thing: "For my part, I made a sort of a move into politics around May '68. As I came into contact with specific problems through Guattari, through Foucault, through Elie Sambar. Anti-Oedipus was from the beginning to the end the book of political philosophy." So part of that reading is probably true. From the beginning, Deleuze and Guattari claimed that an appeal to ignorance in order to answer to this fundamental question of political philosophy would be an epistemic failure. Following Reich, they provide us with a different explanation, one that revises the notion of desire. And it comes with no surprise that Deleuze and Guattari do not propose just a minor clarification of the notion of desire. As Deleuze says in his interview with Claire Parnett, quote, "We had an enormous ambition. Notably, when one writes a book, we thought that we would say something new. That is, in undertaking our task as philosophers, we were hoping to propose a new concept of desire," end of quote. I would like to highlight 4 central features of Deleuze and Guattari theory of desires. I'm definitely not claiming that this is a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for understanding their conception of desire. The first key distinction that Deleuze and Guattari are making is between desire and interest. If rational choice theory tells us that we act in such a way as to maximize our interest, Deleuze and Guattari stress that, quote, "Our interests exist as a possibility only within the context of a particular social formation," end of quote. For example, if I have an interest in becoming an academic, the series of actions that are rationally oriented towards this goal are possible because my desires and my drives and impulses are themselves invested in the social formation of what makes this interest possible. Thus, desire is always an assemblage, a construction of drives that is, from the beginning, positively invested in the system that allows you to have this particular interest. We cannot think of them separately. This is the way in which Deleuze and Guattari overcome a certain form of dualism between the production of our physical reality and the production of our social reality. The central claim is that our interests are not mere abstractions or things that we lack. Our desires are positive insofar, quote, "What we desire, what we invest our desire in, is a social formation," end of quote. We're not fundamentally, think Deleuze and Guattari, the kind of being that are defined in reference to something that we lack, perfection, purity, etc. On the contrary, we spend our time constructing. When we say, "I desire this," or "I desire that," quote, we do not extract an object that is presumed to be the object of desire, but we're in the process of constructing a desired assemblage, think Deleuze and Guattari. And then, sort of as a parallel, there's always a kind of a common critique of the notion of their notion of desire, which, probably it's, in part it is, I think it's misguided. Namely that in subtracting desire from lack, law, castration, they will end up with a form of naturalized notion of desire that is consequently repressed by society. And in part, this is probably Judith Butler's view in Subjects of Desire, when she says that what characterizes Deleuze and Guattari's notion of desire, and as an originary, unrepressed, libidinal diversity subject to the prohibitive laws of culture, or as an ahistorical or pre-cultural ideal a la Rousseau and Montesquieu, or as a natural eros, that will ultimately produce just a form of liberation to a more boundless form of desire. I think that kind of reading misses something important about Deleuze and Guattari. And Deleuze gives us an example. Imagine one desires to drink, but one doesn't just desire alcohol. Quote, "Drinking never means solely I desire to drink this and that. It means either that I desire to drink alone, all alone while I'm working, or I desire to drink all alone while I'm relaxing, or I desire to drink going out with friends, or to go to some cafe." So for Deleuze and Guattari, to desire to drink is always an assemblage that I'm constructed. The assemblage of a drink, a friend, or a good book, or a paper that I'm writing, or a place. So the first initial thing, desire is productive and introduces assemblages. The second feature of Deleuze and Guattari theories of desire is intimately linked to the first one, and it helps us understand the fundamental question of political philosophy. If desire is always prior to interest or will, we can see now how we could reply to Reich's question. Why do people fight for their servitude as stubbornly as though it were their salvation? How do we continue to invest in a social formation that represses us? Following Deleuze, Dan Smith notes, the answer might be quite simple. It is because your desires are not your own, so to speak, says Smith. What does it mean that one's desires are not our own desire? For Deleuze and Guattari, it means that one's desires are not just part of one psychic reality. They are always, already, part of the very social formation one finds oneself in. This is one of the most significant legacies of Reich's writing, since this aspect of Deleuze and Guattari, this notion of desire, reinforces Reich's sex economic hypothesis. Libidinal economy and political economy are one and the same. And probably, as numerous Deleuze scholars have pointed out, this is one of the most profound and far-reaching theses of anti-Oedipus, that libidinal economy, the libidinal economy of Freud and the political economy of Marx are one and the same economy, as they note in anti-Oedipus. Affects or drive form part of the infrastructure itself, even though there are different regimes, they would say. And at the heart of this question is this concept of assemblage. Third, the difference between desire and interest maps onto the difference between rational and irrational. In his piece on capitalism and desire, Deleuze warns us that, quote, once interests have been defined within the confines of a society, the rational is the way in which people pursue those interests and attempt to realize them. Certainly, we shouldn't fool ourselves and believe that rationality is really the defining element here. What Deleuze and Guattari is saying is that underneath that, you find desire. Investments of desires that are not to be confused with investments of interest, and on which interests depend for their determination and their varied distribution. For Deleuze and Guattari, this is one of the central departures from psychoanalysis. Quote, if reason is always a region carved out of irrational, underneath our rational behavior, our investments in our lives, in pension funds and so on, there is delirium, would say Deleuze and Guattari. There are all kinds of libidinal unconscious flows that constitutes the delirium of this society, end of quote. Fourth, Deleuze and Guattari think of the movement of desire in reference to Kant's critique of practical reason, where desire is defined in causal terms. Quote from Anti-Oedipus, desire is the faculty which by means of representation is the cause of the actuality of the objects of those representations, end of quote. Whereas superstitions and fantasies are for Kant lower forms of desires, acts or freedoms on the higher ones. However, they definitely modify Kant's model. Here I want to stress only one of the two modifications they made, namely that desire is productive. And what desire produces, instead of producing fantasies, desire produces what desire produces is real. Hence, the social and political reality is, quote, a historically determined product of desire, end of quote. And if desire produces historically determined social formation, history as such becomes a history of desire. In short, I think I have identified four key features of Deleuze and Guattari's theory of desire. First, desire is different than interest. It precedes interest, and it is always a positive assemblage. Second, desires are not our own. They are social from the beginning, and only if we understand the social production of desire, we can equally explain our direct political investment in social structure that repress us. Thus, Deleuze and Guattari carry forward Reich's legacy in their acknowledgement that he was, as they say, from Anti-Oedipus, the first to raise the problem of the relationship between desire and the social field, end of quote. Third, desire is an enormous flow that continues the delirium of the society with its historical determinations. Fourth, desire shouldn't be understood as lack, but as a productive process which produces the real. If Deleuze and Guattari's account of desire was deeply influenced by Reich's question of repression, so was Foucault's thinking affected by his relationship with the Freudo-Marxist tradition. So this is the second part. Foucault, La volonté de savoir, and Reich. Foucault's relationship with the Freudo-Marxist tradition is tumultuous and complex. And before unpacking Foucault's 1976 as developed in part 4 in the objective section of La Volonté de Savoir, I wanted to open this section with an anecdote, as reported by Daniel Defer in his chronology in Deeds as Écrits. For me, it stands as evidence for Foucault's initial intuition regarding the Freudo-Marxist tradition. So here we are, March 1972, just after the publication of Oedipus. Foucault says to Deleuze jokingly, quote, "We have to get rid of Freudo-Marxism," to which Deleuze replies, "I'll take care of Freud. Can you take care of Marx?" End of quote. This non-linear relationship with the Freudo-Marxists ends up nonetheless with Foucault's unequivocal rejection of this conceptual schema, up to calling it dangerous. Where does this danger come from? Foucault's concern with the notion of desire comes from its negative nature, that somehow would always play the function of revealing our inner self through processes of confession. Second, Foucault is also concerned with the fact that the production of self-discourse, where desire is the primary vehicle, was co-opted into a whole array of standardizing discourses and made possible a system of sexual normalization. And last, Foucault is also concerned that thanks to normalizing processes, norms are implanted back into individuals, and thereby producing new identities that may control, manage, govern, and so on. That is the move that Foucault identifies when he says, quote, "Tell me what your desire is, and I'll tell you who you are," the process of identification. "And I'll tell you if you are normal or not," the process of normalization. "And I'll tell you also if I can disqualify you in your desires or not," the question of control. This is Foucault's normalization and control argument. But before he even formulated his argument in 1976, Foucault has already had this intuition about the limits of Freudo-Marxism. What is Foucault's intuition, such that as early as 1972, he already seems to be divorced from this tradition that was so important and so present in France at the time? One hint comes from 1972 Intellectuals in Power, where he says, quote, "Maybe Marx and Freud are not sufficient to help us learn more about this very enigmatic, at once visible and invisible, hidden and present, all-investing thing that we call power," end of quote. This kind of argument from epistemic insufficiency stands at the heart of La Volonté de Savoir. Foucault's point is that the supporters of the repressive hypothesis cannot make sense of a series of historical events such as the proliferation of sexual discourses, infantile sexuality, the emergence of masturbation as a political problem, and thus they cannot claim that the history of the last centuries in a Western society manifest a movement of power that was essentially repressive. Certainly, Foucault realizes that psychoanalysis and its Freudo-Marxist variation is not falling squarely within the boundaries of his critique. As he notes on page 81 of La Volonté de Savoir, psychoanalysts have been claiming that sex is not repressed. Psychoanalysts, says Foucault, quote, "have challenged the simple little machinery that comes to mind when one speaks of repression," end of quote, since power and desire are joined together in more significantly complex ways. This very complexity and the relation power-desire is the object of Foucault's third doubt, as you remember. Is there, quote, "really a historical rupture between the age of repression and the critical analysis of repression, which is the object of the Freudo-Marxist tradition?" The challenge here is not merely to think of a desire-power relation or to acknowledge that, quote, "where there is desire, the power relation is already present," as Foucault says in The History of Sexuality. The challenge is to qualify this relation and to ask ourselves, once we recognize that power is a constitutive element of desire, whether the only possible outcome is that we're always already trapped in power relations. Power is not external to desire, and as such, the promise of liberation becomes a mere hope. For Foucault, both the repressive hypothesis and, in part, probably the Freudo-Marxist psychoanalytic tradition that provide us with an explanation that at the heart of this explanation stands the idea that law constitutes desire. And this explanation shares, quote from Foucault, the same putative mechanism of power, the juridical one. This mechanism is restrictive, poor in resources, sparing of its method, monotonous, incapable of invention, doomed to always repeat itself, and, quote from Foucault, it only had the force of the negative on its side, end of quote. It cannot produce anything, and it just posits limits, says Foucault. Moreover, by being committed to the idea that law constitutes desire, psychoanalysis is committed to the idea that a parent-child relationship, according to Foucault, is at the root of everyone's sexuality, to the extent that it is through them that you gain access to desire. And if our desire is always somehow constructed around incestuous desire through confession, psychoanalysis, says Foucault, lifts psychical repression and allows individuals to express it in their discourse. But at the same time, within the deployment of sexuality, this form of discursive formation, which was supposed to have an alleviating factor, had also an authoritarian and constraining influence by postulating that one has no sexuality, quote from Foucault, except by subjecting oneself to this law, to this juridical understanding of desire. Hence Foucault's impetus to conduct this kind of critique at the level of a theory of desire in order to show that the historical political critique of sexual repression in a Reichian sense could not be successful, since it will always be tied to the fact that it was always unfolded within the deployment of sexuality and not outside or against, end of quote. Given that a negative form of power, whose structure is the law, is constitutive of desire, changes in sexual behavior are not evidence for any anti-repressive struggle, but for Foucault, they are a tactical shift, a reversal in the great deployment of sexuality. Hence, Foucault's rather strong assessment that the Freudo-Marxist tradition is dangerous, since given our historical political situation, it continues to preach the liberation of our desire as a political panacea. And in 1977, Foucault concludes, Reich's conceptual schema has to be completely abandoned. Deleuze, Guattari, Foucault, and the Freudo-Marxist tradition. So far, I have established, I hope, that Deleuze and Guattari share rather different, Deleuze and Foucault share rather different relations with the Freudo-Marxist tradition. Deleuze believes that thinking of repression amounts to answering the most fundamental political problem in political philosophy, and thereby he remains profoundly attached to Reich's writings. On the other hand, Foucault identifies that the form of constitutive sexual desires in the Freudo-Marxist tradition remains deeply negative, limited, uninventive, and failing to capture and explain the significant historical aspects regarding sexuality during the 19th century. It would seem that given this picture, Reich stands as the very source of this continuing conceptual divergence between Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari. In the remainder of this section, I want to develop two additional points to capture the significance of their allegiance to the Freudo-Marxist tradition. Let's start with Deleuze and Guattari. I think it would be properly misleading to think of anti-Oedipus and to assume that in anti-Oedipus, Deleuze and Guattari merely endorsed Reich's conception of desire. Deleuze and Guattari equally criticized Reich specifically for failing to conceive of desire as desiring production. That is to say, for failing to understand desire as a constitutive force of production and thus failing prey to something like Foucault's repressive hypothesis. And here are two fairly long quotes from Anti-Oedipus. They write, quote, "Yet Reich himself never manages to provide a satisfactory explanation of this phenomenon, why people desire their own oppression. Because at a certain point, he reintroduces precisely the line of argument that he was in the process of demolishing, by creating a distinction between rationality as it is or ought to be in the process of social production and the irrational element of desire, and by regarding only this latter as a suitable subject for psychoanalytic investigation. Hence, says Foucault and says Deleuze and Guattari, quote, the sole task that he assigns psychoanalysis is the explanation of the negative, the subjective, the inhibited within the social field. Reich therefore necessarily returns to a dualism between the real object, rationally produced on the one hand, and irrational fantasizing production on the other. He gives up trying to discover the common denominator or the co-extension of the social field and desire. In order to establish the basis for genuine materialistic psychiatry, there was a category that Reich was sorely in the need of, that of desiring production, which would apply to the real in both its so-called rational and irrational forms. The fact that there is a massive social repression that has an enormous effect on desiring production in no way vitiates our principle. Desire produces reality, or it's stated another way, desiring productions is one and the same thing as social production, end of quote. So given this critique, merely assuming that Deleuze and Guattari are entirely committed to the Freudo-Marxist tradition would probably be a serious misreading of their notion of desire, which in many ways it is designed, or it seems to be designed, to escape the very limitation of Reich's account of desire. Foucault is certainly keen in recognizing this aspect of anti-Oedipus. Back to May 1973, to the lecture that he gave at the Pontifical Catholic University at Rio de Janeiro, he claims, quote, "Since the last year's publication of the book by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, Anti-Oedipus, the reference to Oedipus plays an entirely different role," says Foucault. Where does the difference stand for Foucault? In the view developed by Deleuze and Guattari, says Foucault, Oedipus is not the truth of nature, but an instrument of limitation and constraint that psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, used to contain desire and insert it within a family structure defined by our society at a particular moment, end of quote. Oedipus is not a secret, the secret conscious of our unconscious, that somehow has to be revealed through confession, but, quote from Foucault, a form of constraint which psychoanalysis tries to impose on our desire and unconscious, end of quote. Moreover, in the roundtable following his 1973 lecture, Foucault provides a particularly supporting reading of Anti-Oedipus, where he highlights not only that some of the book's merits, right, a robust critique of the idea that the Oedipal structure is the fundamental structure of human existence, but he also points out Deleuze's plural conception of desire. All this leads us to believe that in 1973, instead of rejecting the framework of Anti-Oedipus, Foucault believes that an additional story about Oedipus as the founding instant of a new type of relation, the power-knowledge relation, still has to be told. On Foucault's end, I think there is a little bit more room for showing that, at least initially, a rather ambivalent relationship with Reich that might seem in dissonance with, a little bit more in dissonance with the 1972 anecdote. Again, in 1973, Foucault notes, "I admit that a problem such as this, the one developed by Reich and the Anti-Oedipus, is very appealing to me," says Foucault, "and that I am also tempted to look behind what is claimed to be the Oedipus story for something unrelated to the indeterminate, endless, repeated story of our desire and our unconscious, but related to the history of a power, of a political power," end of quote. In this affinity with Anti-Oedipus persists even beyond 1973. It's, you all know it very well. In a footnote, in a second footnote to Discipline and Punish, Foucault notes, "I could give no notion by reference or quotation what this book owes to Gilles Deleuze and the work he is undertaking with Guattari." And similarly, in 1975, in an interview called Asile, Sexualité, Prison, while highlighting some limitation of Reich's view, and some limitation of Van Hussel's Histoire de la répression sexuelle, Foucault recognizes nonetheless that Reich's response to the question of sexual repression is generally correct. And I could probably continue to provide you with a number of our interviews where Foucault not only appreciates Reich's fundamental political question, but even admits the validity of Reich's schema of analysis. The real break, I think, comes in 1975 at Columbia University at the Schizoculture Conference, where Foucault makes a really bold statement. Quote, "I now see the Reichian schema as an obstacle rather than as an instrument," end of quote. The Reichian schema is fully revealed in that conference paper as an obstacle, and in La Volonté de Savoir, published a year later, he provides us with the most refined argument. any explanation of sexuality that focuses primarily on sexual repression, as Reiches does, cannot escape analyzing the underlying power mechanism otherwise than in a reduced, schematic, and negative form. Quote, which is to say that these analyses assume that power exerts itself basically in the form of an interdiction and exclusion, end of quote. Against Reich, Foucault argues that rather than being deductive, power mechanisms produce, invent, create, and ultimately normalize sexual objects. Reich's failure is to confound and to merge the strategies of power with the interdictions of the law and with the mechanism of domination and exploitation. Hence, quote, the rallying point for the counterattack against the deployment of sexuality of not to be sex desire, but bodies and pleasure, as you all remember. This line against the Freudo-Marxist tradition seems equally, in a way, to apply to Deleuze-Guattari, doesn't it? Foucault's departure from the notion of desire, as developed in La Volonté de Savoir, doesn't, I think, amount to a rejection of Deleuze-Guattari's notion of desire. And we have a later confirmation from his 1978 interview with Jean-Louis II. When asked if social relations should be perceived as a permanent circulation of desire, Foucault presses himself to point out that desire has played a normalizing function in society. But only a few sentences later, Foucault also claims that Deleuze and Guattari obviously used the notion in a completely different way. And he continues, quote, I'm quite frankly hostile to the pre-Deleuzian or non-Deleuzian notion of desire, end of quote, since it was forged and grounded on numerous medical psychological presuppositions. Unlike the Freudo-Marxist notion of desire, the one deployed by Deleuze and Guattari is not negative in nature. It doesn't imply lack. Moreover, it doesn't produce his identity in the way that Foucault would be concerned with, but only assemblages or multiplicity. It is heseity, that is, that which makes something particular and not universal, as opposed to quiddity. And it does so not by positing new forms of subjectivity that could be controlled. On the contrary, assemblages of desire, the way Deleuze and Guattari understand them, they construct, on the contrary, by constructing different assemblages, desire cannot be any more the vehicle for normalization, since normalization demands uniformity, and Deleuze and Guattari notion of desire produces heterogeneity. However, strategically speaking, Foucault believes that by using the notion of desire, which in the end means nothing, however, strategically speaking, Foucault believes that we should abandon the notion of desire and use the notion of pleasure. Because the notion of pleasure, in the end, says Foucault, means nothing, which is still, it seems to me, says Foucault, rather empty of content and insulated by possible uses. In treating pleasure ultimately as nothing other than an event that happens, I would say, outside the subject, says Foucault, or at the limit of the subject, or between two subjects. In this, pleasure is something that has neither to do with the body. In this something that is neither of the body nor of the soul, neither outside nor inside. This notion of pleasure is a good means of avoiding the entire psychological and medical armature that was built on a traditional notion of desire. So back to my initial question as a way of concluding. If the desire-pleasure problem is not a matter of incompatibility, what can one nonetheless help us explain of this conceptual divergence between Deleuze's notion of desire and Foucault's notion of pleasure, as they seem to persist? So to a certain extent, the analysis of the relationship with the Freudo-Marxist tradition provides us not only with an even stronger argument against the incompatibility pieces, but also with a certain kind of explanation as to why this divergence persists. Albeit, I will grant you this, still only a partial explanation. Nonetheless, both Deleuze and Foucault and Guattari lean in the same direction, as Foucault mentioned in his 1977 introduction to Anti-Oedipus. Namely, they all want to move towards an experience and a technology of desire that is no longer Freudian. they are all fighting against, quote, the poor technicians of desire, who would subjugate the multiplicity of desires to the twofold law of structure and lack, end of quote. Their respective philosophy address the question of desire and pleasure, since they both want to find ways to propose an introduction to a non-fascistic way, or to a non-fascistic life. In the end, I think this is their common cause. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Nicholas. Very simple question, not knowing Deleuze very well, but in affirming desire, just literally doesn't desire mean that you want something or you're lacking something? So what, I don't understand how the affirmation or the affirmative position of desire, like what?
So for him, the question of affirmation is, it's a question of production, right? That he really believes that instead of lacking an object that you don't have, you're producing that object. That's part of what he really wants. This is why he goes back to Kant in a way, and to this reversal of Kant. The idea would be that, desire produces an assemblage, and it's always a positive assemblage, right? When I desire a drink, I don't desire something that I don't want. I constantly produce that assemblage. I desire a drink with friends in a certain kind of specific kind of fashion. So it's from the get-go for him, it's positive.
But in the moment of desiring, you're not with those friends. So you're lacking those friends. That's why you desire to be.
True, but the desire produces the reality of that, right? Desire doesn't start with the lack of the object, but produces the very social assemblage. So in other words, you don't start with a representation in the back of his mind for him, and therefore reality ends up being produced. Desire is a flow for him that constantly produces social assemblages. This is why it's affirmative in that sense, and it's not a sense of lack. I think that's, or at least that's what he wants to move away from, even if it doesn't convince us.
So to start, thank you for bringing in this other name into the debate, namely Deleuze. And maybe, it's impossible to ask that question, Lacan contra Foucault, without Deleuze. So we need, somehow it's a weird triangle. And just to take a step back, I mean, it's really quite remarkable, the parallelism of Deleuze and Foucault vis-a-vis psychoanalysis. In the 60s, you have Deleuze producing, so difference of repetition and logic of sense, which have enormously interesting positive appropriations of psychoanalysis. Not just sort of bringing psychoanalysis into Deleuze's project, but really thinking with psychoanalysis and pushing its program further. And you have the same thing with Foucault in the 60s in The Order of Things. Extremely interesting things he says about Lacanian psychoanalysis. I know Mellon this morning said he praises psychoanalysis, but for the wrong reasons. But sometimes I'm tempted to say he gets things exactly right, and even pushes things forward. So you have this kind of parallel movement in the 60s, and in the 70s you have a parallel turn against. And it's on exactly the same issue, namely the Oedipal nature of psychoanalysis. So first you have Deleuze with Guattari and Anti-Oedipus, and then you have Foucault, in The Will to Knowledge, the first volume in 76. Both attack psychoanalysis, so there's this kind of turn, and for exactly the same reason, but nonetheless, Deleuze and Foucault after this hate each other. So they attack psychoanalysis for the same reason, but with completely different rationales. Now that's fascinating. And if we can understand that, we would really make a big leap forward. Why that takes place. Now, I can't really answer that quickly now, but I just want to make a couple observations, because I think your paper, for me, you end on a too conciliatory note, for my taste anyway. If we think about it, it all kind of revolves around the value that you put on the term repression. I mean, to be very simple, Deleuze and Guattari think you can critique Oedipal sexuality, but you absolutely have to retain the concept of repression. And Foucault says, no, we get rid of both at the same time. Now, what's funny is, if Foucault tells to Deleuze, well, you still have a too negative conception of desire based on repression, that sounds awfully funny. If you read any Deleuze, again and again, positive nature of desire, assemblages, blah, blah, blah. And if you say to Deleuze and Guattari, well, you're simply part of that discourse of the liberation of desire, okay, maybe, but that's an awfully weak reading of a theoretically very sophisticated work. That would be a very weak reading of Foucault's work. You could do it. But now, if you take the opposite tack, when Foucault says you have to oppose to the sex desire, the bodies and pleasures, the great irony is Foucault says nothing about the body in his book. Now, that doesn't mean you can't find other resources in Foucault to constitute a theory of what the body would be. But what's funny is in that book, he says almost nothing. It's very opaque. Whereas Deleuze and Guattari have an extremely sophisticated notion of the body. And what is their notion of the body? It's that the body represses itself. That's what the body without organs is. The body without organs represses the partial objects, the partial drives. That's primal repression. They're very clear on that. And what's funny is that's already in Logic of Sense. So you bring up the paper, you know, when Foucault writes his review of Logic of Sense, so it's not just in the 70s, it's already in the 60s. When Foucault writes his review of Logic of Sense, you see what he focuses on, the problem of sense, the problem of the event, the surface of sense, but he says nothing about Deleuze's theory of the body that's already there. Why? Because Deleuze already has this strong theory of repression in the 60s, which carries over into Anti-Oedipus without any break or turn or whatnot. So it all turns around this problem of repression. Do we need it or not? And I'm tempted, let me just make one suggestion. I bring up something horrible for Foucauldians, but you know, what use can we make of repression? Now, you know, one of the big breaks, so that was a really serious break between Deleuze and Foucault. I mean, they don't talk for a decade, I think, over this question. They don't talk. Yeah, they don't talk ever again.
Ever again.
And I think one of the real sore points, let me just bring this up, is the affair Glucksmann. So one of the sore points is about the new philosophy in France. And you see that Deleuze, with his concept of repression, has a very strong argument against Glucksmann. Whereas Foucault, without the concept of repression, has a kind of strange, I don't think you can explain away his positive review of the master thinkers. Surely it's a strategic point. I think there is some of that. But you see that he was tempted towards this notion of getting rid of any kind of idea of revolution, that the Marxism, these structures of thought are necessarily dominant precisely because he also wanted to get rid of repression. So I just point that out as maybe that's a symptomatic point. Okay. Anyway, sorry for a very long.
I think I almost agree with everything you said. Yeah. I would say that they don't talk after 77, probably not just in relation to.
But then you're too conciliatory.
I think
talk when you merge them in a concerted.
No, I think what I want to do by the end of the day, it's like realizing that that I don't believe that, you know, the problem is as clear and as oppositional as people want to read it. I think Foucault has, you know, I think Foucault changes his mind, for example, about the status of the concept of desire from 76 till he dies, for example. It's kind of interesting that, you know, in the introduction, I think, to the second volume of the History of Sexuality, he says, I want to do a genealogy of the desiring subject, right? So I think it's way more, I think when one looks only as, you know, in 1976, the first volume of the History of Sexuality, Foucault kind of wants to move away from that. And I think partly he wants to move away from that, especially for strategic reasons. Because he constantly sees in the concept of desire a sort of a recuperation by medical and psychiatric discourses that will always use desire as a way to normalize subject. Yeah. So that will be the worry. But I think after 77, I think they have a number of reasons why they talk to each other. The Les Nouveaux Philosophes is one of them. I think the Klaus Croissant affair is equally a very significant one, where they really completely, and interestingly enough, it's not even clear that in that Klaus Croissant affair, it wasn't actually, Guattari was at the heart of it, and Deleuze, you know, it was in the middle of it. Deleuze and Guattari was just sort of sitting. But nonetheless, you know, he's still the one who, you know, they don't talk till Foucault dies, and Deleuze is still the one who reads an obituary, as, you know, at Foucault's. I mean, there is a strong sense of friendship that I think, regardless of their divergences, never so little.
Just as a quick rejoinder, sorry, I would like to think that it's beyond sort of biographical and, let's say, political in the sense of interests, leanings, but that there is a theoretical core of this problem. That's what I want to get at. I'm not saying don't have a quick, you know, but I think it's a real theoretical problem, and I'm tempted, my hypothesis, it really is around the theoretical status of repression.
So there is a sense in which I think there is probably that. I also don't believe that in the history of sexuality, even in the volume 1, repression is completely thrown away. I think repression, Foucault never says that there is no such thing as repression. Right. He simply says, here's one interesting thing about this sexuality that happened in the 19th century. Therefore, all those people who use the paradigm of repression to explain those kinds of things fail to do that, right? And I think even when he targets that question of repression, there's in that schizoculture conference in '75, he really precedes the '76, he's really targeting this very specific volume by Van Husserl, whose Histoire de la répression sexuelle, which really kind of, he feels like, okay, here's a paradigm that you want to explain sexual practices. Repression doesn't do all the work, and he says, can you establish repression as a historical fact? He says, no, if you look at 19th century, you can't really do that. And even if you establish that, what is the mechanism that underlie that kind of paradigm? And he goes on into providing it's true.
So there you would
the status of repression, I think. No. I agree with you. The status of repression is really there. And I think just one last line. Yeah. I think actually Foucault probably doesn't believe that the fundamental question of political philosophy is the repressive question.
Right. So you would agree that it seems like for Foucault, repression is a historical notion that we can historicize. Deleuze and Guattari would say it's a transcendental notion.
That's a tough one. That's really a tough one. Yes and no. Yes and no. Because it's a weird kind of transcendental, even if it is. I mean, I think it's page 307 in Anti-Oedipus that said there are no such thing as desire assemblages that are not social and historical assemblages, true and true. So it's not transcendental somehow that it's outside. But so I agree. I think they have a weird kind of ontology in the background, Deleuze and Guattari, that Foucault probably doesn't share. Yeah.
No, just a quick point. Maybe it's too biographical, and we said we don't want to actually look for biographical reasons for this increasing divergence between Foucault and Deleuze, and most likely due to different positions with regard to psychoanalysis, but also repression. I agree with Aaron. It's not just a triad. I mean, you brought in Deleuze because you needed to create. You said it like a bridge between Foucault and Lacan. There's a fourth guy, and it's Guattari, so I agree. When, very superficial anti-Deleuzian readings of Anti-Oedipus or Deleuze in general blame Guattari for, turning the best historian of philosophy or the best ontologist.
Zizek does exactly that. Yeah.
Well, it's more complex, I think, what Zizek does. Then in the wake of Slavoj, other people done that. So that's wrong, but at the same time, and this is the biographical thing, don't forget that, and actually I'd like to hear what you make of it, don't forget that it's much more difficult for Deleuze to get away from psychoanalysis repression. I'm simplifying psychoanalysis / repression in that kind of discourse, because of the level of commitment, personal level of commitment that Guattari has with not just psychoanalysis, but Jacques Lacan. I mean, Anti-Oedipus, if you look at it from Guattari and forget about Deleuze, so you do the reverse kind of operation, it's about Lacan. I mean, you read the Anti-Oedipus paper, it's just this guy having nightmares about Lacan and the analysis of him. I think those papers are, reading Anti-Oedipus without the Anti-Oedipus paper is a big mistake. I mean, of course, they were not meant to be read in that way, but
no, completely. I couldn't agree more. I think there is, I wrote down this quote on Anti-Oedipus on page 27. They say, we really want to follow Lacan's tradition, and they say we see Lacan's theory of desire as having two poles for us, one that is related to the object of a small a, that they read as a desiring machine, that is the productive side, is the productive notion, and that they see the other pole that is related to the great other, to as a signifier, and so on and so forth. So they kind of want to push one completely. Yes, and Guattari couldn't get away, because as you said, for all the reasons you said. Yeah. So I think they're completely indebted to Lacan. Just in a way, I think they want to take Lacan in a direction that probably the most orthodox readers of Lacan didn't want to take him.
Well, thank you very much for this paper. I would maybe underline just to add some commentaries to some things. And well, one is, I argued this morning that it's difficult and even embarrassing to read today Foucault's polemics against psychoanalysis, because we can hardly find that either Freud or Lacan ever maintained the things that he's ascribing to them. And it's historically quite true that their opponent is somehow the Freudo-Marxism such as was present in the 60s, which is largely forgotten now. And that actually the figure of Wilhelm Reich was at the core of these polemics, not so much what Freud really said, what Lacan really maintained. And here comes another curious thing. I mean, if you look at the whole question of desire, the whole question of productivity of desire, and or else desire being premised on ontology of a lack and negativity, etc. Lacan's most famous seminar is called The Four Fundamental Concepts of Psychoanalysis. Desire is not one of them. You have the unconscious, the repetition, the drive, and the transfers. By 1964, Lacan didn't even consider desire to be the key to the fundamental things in psychoanalysis. And you can find formulations in Lacan that desire is a form of resistance. It's a resistance against puissance. Desire is a formation of resistance. So the key concept at that point for Lacan would be the concept of the drive. And here one can make the argument, actually, Aaron made this argument at some length in this book, which is coming out precisely on this question of the relation between Deleuze and Lacan, that if you look at the way that the question is posited in Anti-Oedipus, actually it would make much more sense to replace, insert, instead of the question of desire, the question of the drive. When Deleuze and Guattari speak about desire, it's actually what they aim at, or what they actually describe, the assemblages, etc. It's what in the Freudian theory is called the drive. I mean, and they somehow reinscribe Lacan's. There is one lesson in the seminar 11 on the fundamental concept, which is called le montage de la pulsion. It's a montage of the drive. But this is precisely what they call assemblage. Yes, this can be. I'm not saying there's a one-to-one translation, but a better way of looking at what they are trying to do in Anti-Oedipus is actually to start reading from the question of the drive rather than the question of desire in Lacan.
I completely agree. So it's really interesting that neither Freud and Lacan sort of gets this very important place, but Reich and Marcuse actually gets to be cited a couple of times, probably like 3 or 4 times in the history of sexuality. So it's kind of clear that, you know, this is why it was exactly the point that you were saying. Like, it's kind of interesting that he's fighting against psychoanalysis. Actually, probably he's fighting against this very specific kind of variation on that it has its own limitation in the way that they've read Freud, at least with respect to Reich. It's really interesting on the question of the drive. I don't know what to think about it, because there is a sense in which they want to take something away from the Freudo-Marxist tradition, which I'm not sure you could still have that just with the notion of the drive. They do want to say this one thing that, you know, comes out of Klosowski, comes out of the Freudo-Marxist tradition, which is to say the libidinal economy is one and the same with the political economy, basically. They want to create this kind of synthesis of Freud and Marx in a way. So whether the notion of the drive would give them the social and political aspect, I don't know. I can't answer that question. But I think they really strive to get at that kind of unification. Because that's part of one of the questions by the end of the day. They really want to answer, like, how can, you know, you desire your own repression? Which is true and true, not just the question of the drive, but it's equally of the drives investing themselves in a very specific social formations that ultimately represses you. So if the notion of the drive could do both a story about our psychic reality plus our investment in social structures that would repress us, they would probably be, yes, the drive for us does exactly what desire does.
You have a whole theory of this in Lacan, and I believe Samuel Tomšić was here last week or what. I mean, the question of the surplus jouissance, the privilege real, it's by Lacan itself, it's carved on the question of the surplus value. I mean, this is how he got to the very question of privilege real. So it was immediately, I mean, in the outset, it was mapped on a certain premises in political economy.
But at the same time, I think that you would agree with me that it's not exactly, I mean, where I still think there is something to be said, that there is a perhaps irreducible difference between Deleuze and Lacan, even if you translate this in terms of the drive, is that I think for Lacan, nevertheless, the drive itself is still premised upon a certain negativity. It's not the same as in desire, but it's not just a kind of positive flow as opposed to desire, which is supposedly always lacking something. Here we just have this surplus object. I mean, the surplus object itself is for Lacan basically kind of negativity at work. I mean, it's positive work. So I think there is a lot to be said, and really Aaron does this splendidly in terms of how the proximity between the two, but nevertheless I would say that there is still this question of negativity which remains. And I think it is also involved, just to go back to also what Aaron said before, I very much agree that the question of repression is crucial here in the dispute or difference between Foucault and Deleuze, and that it also brings in precisely the third party, which is Lacan and psychoanalysis. Because I think basically, and I will be speaking about this more in detail on Friday, but basically what psychoanalysis says is that there is no repression without repression in the Freudian sense of verdrängung. And that this kind of, there is this kind of double, I mean the concept of repression is already premised upon something else that is a different kind of repression, and that without this double conceptual apparatus, one doesn't have a good theory of repression. If one just reduces repression to some kind of a positive suppression of things, then one fails to kind of conceptualize it properly. Where does it, how precisely does it fit itself? Why do we subject ourselves? I mean, this is, for psychoanalysis, it is clear. It is because repression, like the Urverdrängung or original repression, it's not about repression of some positive fact or emotion or whatever, but it is a kind of a structure that is out there precisely, and it is as such, in this sense, this kind of a pure negativity that kind of generates the positive flow of both surplus enjoyment, social repression, and so on. So, but, okay. Sorry.
I'm not sure I have
Sorry to just make an intervention, but it's I think it's a little complicated, right? Because as Mellon says, one, negativity, the universal, all of these things just can't be magically projected and associated with Freudo-Lacanianism, right? And I wouldn't say Freudo-Marxism is dead if it's Lacanian Marxism. I mean, what else is Zizek or Tomšic's new book? Nicole, there is this line in Anti-Oedipus, every drive is a possible protest, right? But the bigger question, which is the ontological question, which is where's negativity, where's the one? And I think this comes out in Badiou's critique of Deleuze, is that the one is not. Whereas for Deleuze, as according to the famous postcard, there is a one. So, and this is another line from Anti-Oedipus, it all comes down to the same on the slippery surface. It always goes back to some sort of oneness. This is why they love Spinoza. And this is exactly what, with the drive, with the very sophisticated drive theory that is in Lacan, that comes out of Schiller, out of Schlegel, right? The German word has a very old provenance. And there's another one too. Nietzsche says, we are holding on to the back of a tiger, dreaming that we know. And what is this tiger? He says it in another place, 50 different drives pulsating all the way in different directions. Pulsion, which Lacan accepts, he ties in to the situationist dérive at one point, right? So some clear, rather fascistic distinctions, Stalinist, as Zizek would say, need to be made between desire and drive, between the one is and the one is not, between ontology as a sort of nostalgia for fullness, completion, pleroma, which would have much negativity in it, if you know Werner Hamaker's book on that. But, so you see, there's this tendency, and I got a certain enthusiasm from Aaron, I believe your name is, and that is exactly what's wrong. Rudinesco quotes Deleuze in the Logic of Sense that he was trying to complete Lacan. So both of them, and this, this good guy, bad breast thing, Guattari's bad, Deleuze is the good historian, he could have been a solid man when he hadn't met that degenerate. That's also wrong, right? There need to be some warning signs, some highway marks to prevent us from being nostalgic, regressive, and trying to return to the one. I think at this late point in history, living here especially, but one only doesn't have to live here to know this, the one is not. and I don't know, I'd love to talk to you about that famous postcard. But that famous postcard was one. But as we all know, postcards have two sides. And the two sides would be, say, desire and drive. Ontology versus an ontology that incorporates and excludes negativity too.
There are so many interesting things in what you just said, but just two quick things. There's definitely a difference in, Deleuze keeps telling himself that he's a metaphysician. Foucault would never call himself a metaphysician. There's a sense in which, even in the parts where Deleuze says that all, desiring assemblages are always social and historical assemblages, there's a sense in which there is something, I wouldn't say ahistorical that happens, but he does believe that, Foucault would never go in that direction. Foucault would always historicize and will look at a very specific practice without trying. And again, this goes back to the question of the role of the universal and how much of the universal is supposed to do an explanation. So I think they come on very different sides as to what it would be the role of, what would be the sort of the ontological status of all those interesting pieces of the puzzle that Deleuze puts on the table, like desire assemblages and so on. I don't know what to think about the question of the one. One of the, especially because I don't see one desire. I think what's really amazing about the Anti-Oedipus, I constantly read the Anti-Oedipus as Deleuze and Guattari being pluralists. Constantly when they talk about desire, they don't talk about one thing. They talk about assemblages that are not just one, but there are this kind of interesting things that is made of objects, that is constantly unstable. And if there is such a thing as one, it's way more of an effect or an event in a way that they want to understand it. So I think they want to think of themselves, and probably goes back to what was this question of multiplicity. And I think the multiplicity that gets later in Foucault is very much this reading of multiplicities that comes out of Deleuze and Guattari. So I don't know how committed they have to be to one, or maybe even if they're committed to a notion like the one, maybe that's
They say the line, it all comes to the same on the slippery surface, mem, and at that time the mem is being totally deconstructed by Derrida. The whole idea of the aucli, of the other, of negativity. So when you write a line like that, you're putting yourself on the side of the one. That's what I mean. That all desires have to come to one eventually, otherwise they all just disperse into infinity. right? And then you need set theory to bring them back together.
But the fact that they come to one, I would say that that's an effect of a multiplicity that coagulates, an assemblage that coagulates at a certain point in a very specific kind of thing. I desire to get a drink, and here's the assemblage that the desire means tonight with friends after the conference. So yes, it will hopefully come to one and we'll have a drink, but it's not that oneness of my desire is plural, true and true. It's a multiplicity.
I'm talking about ontological one. And there's also Badiou's critique of anti-Oedipus, and then there's one last line. Jameson said, when you critique something like Oedipus so strongly, there has to be a grain of truth in it, right? So this desire to just escape into what is... Thanks, though.
Well, I'll follow that with another desire. And then hand it over to Johanna. I actually have a question for Nikolai, but also for the company, because one of the things I think that's really striking line through all three talks today is this emphasis on, hey, Foucault's responding to a particular variant of Freudo-Marxism. And specifically a variant of Freudo-Marxism that's largely superseded in conversations today, right? You read Marcuse with a kind of joyous nostalgia, like, oh, wouldn't it be nice? Like, yeah, I wish I could buy the simplicity of some of that. Like, I wanna believe that. I guess my question is sort of about whether the critiques of that, this phenomenon, this Reichian Marcusean phenomenon that's largely not part of our conversations today, whether there's a critique of that that's also a critique of the new forms of combinatorial psychoanalytic and Marxist political theory and social theory. So that is to say, is there something in the Freudian critique that's transferable, that's useful for us still in some way, relative to what people are doing now? Or is the critique as superseded as the things that it was critiquing? That's a question for Nikolai, but also really for the company, and I think that's general. I don't even need an answer. I'll turn the mic over to Johanna. But that's...
I take it that really, I take it that the target is very much the... I think there are probably, resources in the Freudian tradition and even in the Lacanian tradition to answer to some of the concerns that are raised by both Foucault and Deleuze and Guattari. I take it that one of the things that they really want to, especially Foucault, what he really wants to struggle against is this idea that sexual repression is one of the main mechanisms for political domination. I think Foucault wants to answer to that, and that's at the heart of the Freudo-Marxist tradition, whether or not that kind of principle that really builds the Freudo-Marxist tradition gets to be easily transferable to other variants of psychoanalysis or later psychoanalysis. So I don't know to what extent that it's true, but that's really, I feel, definitely Foucault's target in multiple ways. So I don't know to what extent. But I also believe, there are resources to answer to some of their worries and to some of their concerns.
Thanks a lot for the great paper. I think Aaron was suggesting that you would be too conciliatory, but I don't think you were. I think Foucault is being too reconciliatory when he's sort of trying to turn this into a mere argument of semantics. I think he's just trying to be nice. He says, perhaps what you call desire is what I call pleasure, as if there was no fundamental difference. And I think you made it clear that there are fundamental differences and so on. And I think, but yeah, and repression and the role of universals and so on. But I think it's important what you said in response, in one of the responses, and this I have always thought is perhaps the most fundamental difference, namely the role of metaphysics. So I think, Deleuze tries to create a new metaphysics explicitly. It's a new theory of desire. Desire is a kind of an important part of this new metaphysics. And for Foucault, pleasure is never anything like this. He doesn't want to do something like that. This is not his project at all. So this is perhaps just a comment.
I completely agree. Yeah, completely. I also, what's really interesting to keep in mind is there is a sense in which desire, who takes this tremendous role in anti-Oedipus, becomes an absolutely secondary concept in Tao and Plateau. So it would seem that almost both Deleuze and Guattari by 1980s, they kind of move away from that kind of real paradigm that was structure politics. It's not that it completely disappears, but Tao and Plateau has very little to do with questions of desire. It has all to do with social assemblages, with war as a paradigm of politics. And interestingly enough, you can see sort of not just the desire-pleasure movement, but you can see even an interesting divergence that I think happens in the ways in which the paradigm of war gets to be used as a really good explanation for how social assemblages tend to emerge. So it's kind of clear that Foucault, after Society Must Be Defended, completely moves away from the paradigm of war. He does the entire, genealogy of war. He goes through the, Klosowski's reversal to all that kind of thing. And by the end of the day, the way you said it, he gets to governmentality, where the question of power is not anymore a question of relation of forces in the way he understood it earlier, but it's very much the ways in which we constrain the space of action of all the others, which is the whole question of conduct. So by 80s, he has such a different view of power that has nothing to do with war, and Deleuze by 80s has such a view of social assemblages that are completely, at the heart of it as the nomadic machine and the war machine. So yes, and interestingly enough, I think the difference comes exactly from the same thing, that Foucault doesn't want to give us universals. And I think in the way he says in that very specific first lecture in The Birth of Biopolitics, where he says it's a question of method, that to me is one of the clearest parts where he says, I'm not interested in universals. I don't want to take the universals and then pass specific events through this grid. I actually want to do the other way around. I want to start with practices without even considering. Yeah, so that's the very interesting part of where metaphysics does quite a little bit of work for Deleuze and Guattari. Yeah. And doesn't do that much. Foucault would take the historical route, the genealogical route, and so
on. So just a question about your last comment about all this issue about the contrast between Foucault's method or disinterested methodological issues. I'm not quite sure. Is it actually possible, like for instance, to characterize things as practices? On the basis of what would one recognize something as practices? What's the relationship between chess, tennis, industrial production, sexual games, calling all these things practices and then describing them in some way? Surely it presupposes operations of kind of categorization and abstraction. Surely he's not saying you can simply describe something without any kind of conceptual presupposition. So given that there's already conceptualization going on, it seems incumbent upon the conceptualizer to explain how he's conceptualizing, what it is he's conceptualizing. So, when you talk about kind of, dispositif, episteme, etc., etc., I don't see how they don't count. You may not want to use the word universal. Also, it's not quite clear what universal means. History of philosophy has lots of different counts of what a universal is. So the claim that anthropological universals are, what's the problem with anthropological universals? In what sense are they, what is it that they leave out? If the claim is that they always elide singularity, well, how do you recognize singularity independently of some reference to a universal? So these methodological issues, it seems, are inescapable. And also, vis-a-vis metaphysics, Deleuze is kind of unashamedly kind of a metaphysician, and he opposes becoming to history. And every concrete assemblage presupposes an abstract machine, which are all tied ultimately to the end of Mille Plateaux, so there's only one abstract machine, which is this kind of pure, aeonic kind of self-constructing cosmic. Yeah, whatever. Whereas, isn't Foucault more indebted to Heidegger and the Heideggerian narrative about the end of metaphysics? So, in the sense that it seems that there are certain questions that it seems that Foucault is obliged to answer about what he's doing or what he thinks he's doing. And the claim that he's just dealing with nothing is more abstract than the concrete. Okay, so saying that you're just describing concrete, something concrete, well, that's just the biggest kind of mystification. So surely there must be more robust ways of answering these questions if you're a Foucauldian than simply saying we're just describing the kind of the heterogeneity. Heterogeneous vis-a-vis what? It's how would you respond to these kinds of issues?
No, this is actually a really great question, and I think that's a question that most Foucauldians struggle with. But I think Foucault would say, for me, those yes, I do use concepts, I do use abstractions. It's not that I don't use them, but they are methodological choices for me. They don't have to contain some sort of substantive metaphysics in the background. And there is a sense in which, I take it that that's one of the points when he says, I don't want to do a theory of power, I actually want to do an analytics of power. And the things that I'm telling you are not somehow universals. Here are some interesting factors about power that seem to be different. Will they always be the same? Will they? No, probably not. So I take it that yes, he does struggle with that kind of thing. And that's always a problem for any kind of Foucauldian. Oh, he's always making choices. How is he not making metaphysical choices? I think for him, those are questions of method. And in a way, you would kind of want to resist that there is something sort of way, way deeper in the background that, they're just questions of method. Whether or not he's indebted to Heidegger, I think that's I don't know, to be honest with you. I wish I had a good answer to that. Part of it, yes, probably yes, but I don't know. And there are so many weird things, to go back to just the last point you made about, Thousand Plateau. There are so many. Deleuze really believes that, not just that there is one, ultimately abstract machine. He believes that actually, there are abstract social assemblages that coexist within a field. That they historically then pop out. He really thinks that those four social. So what he adds, he has something like primitive capitalism, and then he adds the fourth one, the word machine. I'm missing one now. So he really believes it's yes. I think there is a very different. Deleuze's commitments are very, very different.
Just that in Mille Plateaux, the book is written as a systematic rejection of representation. It's not representing anything, and it's about also construction. So that they claim that this machinic diagramming is it's kind of generated by it's the real writing itself. They say this explicitly. So there's no representation going on. Historicization is a function of representation. So the question is so if Foucault rejects representation. Okay, so he's not representing. Okay, what is it he's doing then? Because he doesn't believe precisely in this kind of that the real expresses itself. In fact, this is where he thinks that Deleuze is too kind of metaphysical in a kind of objectionable sense.
I think Deleuze's way out is this very interesting notion of the virtual in a way, where he can allow himself. To have all those abstract social assemblages existing virtually. Whereas I think, again, that's really not what Foucault does. For him, we'll probably say, I don't need that for my genealogical explanation. I probably need some minimal commitments in terms of method without substantial metaphysics in the background. And then again, he wouldn't assume, I'm not sure he would need to assume that. But again, I know it's a very partial answer to your question. But ultimately, I think I think there is a very interesting discussion would be what is the role of the virtual in Deleuze's metaphysics, and how can you do what Foucault does without that kind of assumption that Deleuze, ultimately places on.
Yeah, I mean, just following up on what Ray was saying, so there is a clear rejection in Foucault of anything vaguely or not so vaguely metaphysical. And I do agree with Ray that by just saying that, you are positioning yourself in the wake of Heidegger. Then what the connection between Heidegger and Foucault is another matter. But then the question is, and that is always my question for Foucaultian with which I've worked, leaving aside metaphysics, and I think it ties in with Ray's point, does Foucault have an ontology? And either he has one, and I think he does, and then one can have a long discussion about it. We had a discussion with Johanna when she came to Kent a couple of years ago. Or if the claim is, no, I'm neither a metaphysician nor doing ontology, then it's a question of method. And I think that was what Ray was trying to say when, claiming that you're not dealing with abstraction to the point of saying, I do not, as a philosopher, and of course, Foucault would say, I'm not either a philosopher. But there is, even in this list of rejections, always a ontological presupposition. Or if you want to claim there isn't such thing, then you have a methodological issue that you have to solve, which is a pretty difficult one to solve and untangle. I don't know what you...
Oh, I think he would like to say that he doesn't have an ontology, but at the same time, and he has only methodological commitments, and he struggles exactly with the question you pointed out, that how would you go about doing that? And at the same time, yeah, one can't help but read stuff like Power Is. And there are so many places where he uses this constant. So I would say, I think he doesn't have one, and he would like to historicize that ontology as much as possible. But then again, how can you do that without running into Ray's question and without running into, it's not an easy question for him. And there are multiple places where he really wants to take up on this question and to really answer that question. Or at least that's my, but probably Joanna has a different reading, but I think that's.
I think, sadly, we're about out of time.
Hello, everybody here. Is that working? Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Rico Francis from the Department of Fine Arts and Art History. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor John Kopchek tonight. John Kopchek is currently Professor in the Department of Modern Culture and Media at Brown University, Rhode Island. Previous to that, for many years, she was at the University of Buffalo, New York, where she was director of the Center for the Study of Psychoanalysis and Culture. She initially studied English literature, but then, almost by accident, I gather, fell for the seductions of film. She then went on to study at the Slade School of Fine Art at University College in London, where again, I gather, she fell for the seductions of psychoanalysis. She then completed a PhD in cinema studies at NYU. Professor Kopchek has referred to herself as a first-generation film theorist, which is undoubtedly true. And by film theory here, she's referring to that very specific methodology, the analysis of film, using primarily psychoanalytic theory with a strong emphasis on questions of sexuality and sexual difference. This particular methodology very quickly established itself as the primary academic discourse in the study of film. In fact, so completely did Professor Kopchek and her colleagues dominate my own view of film studies that it was only recently that I discovered, to my astonishment, that there were people who did what they considered to be film studies without psychoanalysis. But how can this be, I found myself thinking? What kind of hollow, unfounded enterprise would there be studies without psychoanalysis. Professor Kopchak has published an enormous amount, including Read My Desire, Lacan Against the Historicists, Imagine There's No Woman, Ethics and Sublimation, and the edited volume, Supposing the Subject. One of the features of her work is the resolute clarity with which she writes about an author whom so many find to be absolutely impenetrable, Jacques Lacan. If I may tell a personal anecdote, in the mid-1990s I was struggling through Lacan's essay on the gaze and frankly not getting very far with it. Then one day I picked up my new copy of Read My Desire and I came across the following phrase. Much of this I take to be compacted in Lacan's otherwise totally enigmatic sentences. My heart started to flutter. Someone else who was confessing to finding Lacan obscure. The paragraph continues, quoting Lacan. The effect of mimicry is camouflaged in the strictly technical sense. It is not a question of harmonizing with the background, but against a mottled background, of becoming mottled, exactly like the technique of camouflage practiced in human warfare. That's Lacan. Then Professor Kopchak resumes her explication. The effect of representation is not a subject who will harmonize with its environment. The subject's narcissistic relation to the representation that constructs him does not place him in a happy accord with the reality that the apparatus constructs for him. The effect of representation is, instead, the suspicion that some reality is being camouflaged, that we are being deceived. Against such a background of perception, the subject's own being breaks up between its unconscious being and its conscious resemblance. As I read, my eyes almost misted over with tears. Everything was falling into place. The veil parted, the sun shone. I almost heard the angels sing. I have never looked back. It is this perspicacity, insight, and clarity that have helped propel Professor Kopchak's type of investigative theory to the status it now enjoys. The issue at stake in the paragraph that I have just read forms a central theme to Professor Kopchak's work, where she is absolutely faithful to Lacan, the notion of a radical uncertainty at the core of the psychoanalytic enterprise. But for Professor Kopchak, this is not a paralyzing uncertainty. It is instead the opportunity for a speculative, and I use the word in a positive rather than a negative sense here, it is the opportunity for a speculative but still rigorous investigation that constantly resists the temptation to proclaim certainties that other theories fall prey to. The titles that I mentioned above speak volumes here, not the subject, but supposing the subject. Neither there is a woman, nor there is no woman, but imagine there is no woman. What then? Professor Kopchak has, of course, been writing about the subject of this conference for a long, long time, and I look forward to hearing what I presume will be a resistance to the idea that no provides any kind of certainty. If I may finish on another personal anecdote. Just a few days ago, I placed a copy of Read My Desire on my desk, and it opened randomly in the middle of one of the essays that I had found particularly powerful at first reading, the Teflon Totem. This is Professor Kopchak's analysis of why the never-ending stream of gaffes committed by Ronald Reagan, known as the Teflon president, only seemed to enhance his popularity. We do not have time to go into that analysis here, but imagine my renewed admiration for Professor Kopchak when a different name, not Reagan's, leapt off the pages at me, none other than Donald Trump. And in exactly the same context of a media fascination that somehow misses the point of what enthralls the public. A prescient essay that I highly recommend, more relevant than ever, on the dangers of trying to resist uncertainty. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's always difficult to be present when you're being introduced. I want to say that I'm very happy to be here in Beirut. I wanted to come for a very long time, so I'm looking forward to seeing a little bit more of it. I want to also stress Laden's point of this morning that I too have a great deal of admiration for Foucault, and so therefore when I was thinking of a subtitle of a book, I was thinking, should it be Lacan versus Foucault, and I held back. I decided rather that I would say against the historicist, and the term historicist recognized, or is almost called, historicism is almost collapsible with Foucault's name. And so I thought people would get the point, but I didn't want to, I did not want to say against Foucault, and I didn't. The other thing I wanted to say is, well, so, but I have written several times against Foucault, nevertheless, and I also agree with Lacan on this point. One of the reason I do this is because I'm absolutely perplexed by his refusal of psychoanalysis. It doesn't make any sense to me at all, and it never seems to me that that what Foucault is saying that Freud said is what he said, and so I have a strange reaction to that. I think the criticism is criticism of Foucault on this question, therefore, is almost too easy. It gives way too easily because he's so obviously wrong. I think the reason to do it, however, to criticize Foucault's reading of Lacan, is first of all because many people take Foucault, his word for it, and therefore don't read psychoanalysis. So one has to dispense with his reading in order to open doors. And the second reason is, I think the practice of activity of answering Foucault should produce the challenge that he presents should produce a kind of a more robust reading of Lacan and Freud's concepts. So that's why I continue, as I say, to do this. Okay, no Foucault. An old accusation resurrected by Foucault held that Freud was a pansexualist, that he talked too much about sex and seemed to find it everywhere. I return to this charge not to deny it, but once again to embrace it. Yes, it was Freud who discovered what I would prefer to call the promiscuity of sex, as long as it is clear that this promiscuity defined for him the nature of sex itself and not a moral judgment regarding an abuse of it. The charge of pansexualism, which I would the charge of pansexualism, which would prefer sex to remain in its proper place, misses its target. Sex doesn't have a place. It doesn't concern a discrete domain of life, but rather the disjoint relation of speaking beings to their bodily existence. Unisolatable from meaning or biology, sex belongs to neither realm and is manifest only in the disruptions, divisions, displacements, and distortions that affect them. This basic point has a history of getting lost, going back to the time when psychoanalysis was first invented. Freud was constantly forced to parry not only the squeamish objections and outright rejections of his theory of sexuality, but also the more insidious problem of its facile and equally squeamish acceptance. Too often, enthusiasm for his ideas relied on an effacement of their complexity and rendered them anodyne. It is thus gratifying to read on the history of the psychoanalytic movement, in which Freud, in high dudgeon, rises up to confront some of the most irritating sterilizations of his ideas then in circulation. He picks out for particular censure two formerly close colleagues, Adler and Jung, whom he labels, lips curled, neo-Zurich secessionists, charging them with selecting a few cultural overtones from the symphony of life and failing to hear the mighty and primordial melody of the instincts. Freud regarded these colleagues as perpetrators of a cultural plot to concoct for psychoanalysis a family romance in which all its major ideas of lowly, that is to say sexual, origin were assigned a higher, more elevated pedigree. In the case of Adler, Freud focused his attack on this colleague's wildly popular notion of masculine protest in order to expose it as the sorry distortion of psychoanalytic thinking it was. Masculine protest names the hypothesis that both sexes recoiled before the feminine position, renouncing the passivity that position entailed. Hopelessly confusing the biological, social, and psychological meanings of masculine and feminine, the idea of masculine protest reposed on the absurd claim that a child, whether a male or female, could found the plan of its life on the original depreciation of the female sex and take the wish to be a real man as its guiding line. And this despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. To wit, children, and this is quoting Freud, children have to begin with no idea of the significance of the distinction between the sexes. The social underestimation of women is completely foreign to them. This sharp reprimand will strike many of us who were too quick to understand Freud's contention that little girls, upon noticing the penis of a brother or playmate strikingly visible in large proportions, at once recognizes it as the superior counterpart of their small and inconspicuous organ, as itself such a conflation. Without having to accept the problematic notion of penis envy, we can still appreciate Freud's crucial point. Superficially, it seems to maintain the innocence of children with regard to sex's significance. But the innocence at issue is more radical, insofar as it is attributed directly to sex. Sex is innocent of meaning. The corruption enters when we try to assign it meaning or accuse Freud of making it the meaning of everything. Adler's notion of masculine protest functioned as a fulcrum from which the principle of pleasure was dislodged from psychic life. It led, as Freud put it, to the complete ejection of sexuality from its place in mental life. The displacement of the principle of pleasure in favor of a principle of power dispensed precisely with the conflictual nature of pleasure, which is never found in just measure, but always experienced rather as deficient or excessive, and a no less conflict-free notion of power. Adler installed at the center of the psyche a principle of power that took account only of those instinctual impulses which were agreeable to the individual and were encouraged by it. All that was opposed to the individual lay beyond its horizon. Eschewing the antagonistic principles of sex and pleasure as mundane and trifling, Adler reached for a grander and more virile principle, and thus robbed himself in the process of psychoanalysis' considerable resources. Nothing was left for him after this initial move but to adopt an old standby for thinking the contestations of power. He ended up accepting the default notion of an abstract opposition that set the individual subject outside and against everything that was foreign and thus opposed to it. Jung fell prey to a similar charge of family romancing. His way of dissolving the conflictual nature of sex and pleasure was to offer a monistic, desexualized concept of drive, one that transformed the archaic, inhuman, insistent pressure that characterized Freud's concept into an infinitely flexible and transformable theory of interest. If whenever Freud said sex, Adler said power, whenever Freud said libido, Jung substituted abstract ideas that remain mystifying and incomprehensible to wise men and fools alike. The most infamous of these was no doubt the idea of archetypes, which defined an eternal cosmological struggle between opposing terms but left each individually intact. If one were to convert Freud's various criticisms of Adler and Jung into a single insight, it would probably sound like this. Whenever one finds two terms locked together in external opposition, you can be certain that another exorbitant term is being evaded. It is instructive to read Foucault's, The History of Sexuality alongside Freud's On the History of the Psychoanalytic Movement. The former is well situated historically to lift some of Freud's burden by detailing the way the too rapid dispersion of psychoanalysis acquired its wings from a sanitizing betrayal and distortion of its concepts. The problem, as everyone knows, is that Foucault's intention is not to track this betrayal, but rather to confound Freud's concepts with their aseptic reception. That Victorian society was not reticent about sex, but talked about it endlessly, does not mean that this society adopted Freud's pansexualism. Sex did not in this moment suddenly emerge as ubiquitous, or again as promiscuous, in psychoanalysis' profound sense. For all the endless discoursing about sex was instead pressed into the service of making it over into the ideal point of the subject's cohesion, the elusive and alluring core of her identity. That this is a terrible distortion of Freud's notion of sex does not dawn on Foucault, who launches into a critique of Freud's repressive hypothesis on the grounds that it sets up an invitation to transgressions that eventuate in the propping up of the very law they would transgress and tether the subject to the endless searching and safeguarding of her identity. This is the obvious flaw in Foucault's argument. Reducing Freud's theory of sexuality, and indeed Freud's theory simply to the monarchy of a single no, prohibition, it not only leaves entirely unexamined the variety of negations invoked by psychoanalysis, it also loses sight of the profound dimension of the unconscious. Freud knew well that prohibition is temptation, and he never argued that the unconscious tempted consciousness. The former is unavailable to the latter, not because the unconscious is prohibited, but because it is foreign to consciousness. What separates the unconscious from consciousness is not prohibition, but something more radical, an impossibility. An obstacle is required, Freud wrote, in order to heighten the tide of libido. How might the Foucauldian critique of psychoanalysis parse this and numerous statements like it? We know the history of sexuality was composed as a refutation of the oft-stated theme that sex is outside of discourse and that only the removing of an obstacle, the breaking of a secret, can clear the way leading to it. Let me put that bottle of water in here. This refutation takes place through an inversion of that theme's logic. It is not the removal of the obstacle, but its setting up that leads to what Foucault refers to as the mirage of sex. In his argument, the obstacle is manufactured by power and always in the same way, via prohibition. Far from casting sex into the shadows, power thrusts sex under the bright lights of scientific scrutiny. Interdiction incites and proliferates discourses about sex, all of which attempt to ferret it out, examine it, and in this way perpetuate power. Saying no to sex, power merely increases the fascination, the frenzied obsession with it. The obstacle is thus necessary to the incitement of its overcoming. It motivates our desire to transgress the law. It is through its supposed overcoming that the obstacle swells the tide of libido. This relation manifests itself, that's Foucault, that's how Foucault would read. That's not how it's read, but that's how Foucault would do it. This relation manifests itself in what Foucault describes as the perpetual spirals of power, wherein the pleasure that comes from exercising power and the pleasure that kindles at having to evade this power circle around and incite each other. Prohibition kindles desire for evasion, and sexual excitement attaches itself to the exercise of power. The circle of incitements of this relation, the clinging harmony of their two-step, can hardly disguise the dreary monotony of the bad infinity they represent. Sex becomes an elusive ideal that perpetually recedes from grasp, and this advantages power by perpetually expanding its territory. Limits are liquidated. There is always one more step to be taken, one more turn of the spiral, but nothing really changes. It is widely known that Foucault came to feel slightly uneasy about the argument of the history of sexuality, to sense that he had trapped himself with his concepts of power relations by failing to cross the line. That is, by failing to think past the impasse of power that permitted no escape from it. That's quoting Deleuze. He opted always for the side of power, unable to think from the other side, from the power of the outside. This trap was set, I am arguing, by his assault on negation, which ends up being too sweeping. If the two targets of his attack, Freudian sexuality and the juridical discursive notion of power, appear almost as one, this is because in his understanding, both only ever establish a negative connection between power and sex. And this is so, Foucault claims, in a surprising moment of candor, even when psychoanalysis conceives law as constitutive of desire. That is, even when law is supposed to act affirmatively, it acts, in this psychoanalytic instance, negatively. Why? Because in affirming desire, law prescribes it, restricts it to what it says it is. Sex becomes a discursive construct. It is made into something intelligible, and thus it is lost. As we will see, prescription becomes the equivalent of proscription. That's Foucault's argument. The moment of the, this moment in the argument is surprising for a number of reasons. First, because it arrives so belatedly in an argument that has thus far ignored Lacan's contributions to the Freudian theory of sexuality, that is, Freud's contribution to the theory of the law as constitutive of desire. But it is surprising as well because the position he condemns in Lacan sounds similar to the one he is thought to have advanced, the one for which he is widely celebrated. Power produces, affirms, and is constituted. We are, moreover, caught off guard by what at first appears as self-reproach. Foucault admits that thus far it may seem that he has proceeded in an obstinately confused way, as if he were dealing with equivalent notions of repression and sometimes of law, of prohibition or censorship. This turns out, however, not to be a confession, but the preface to another accusation. The various forms of negation employed by Freud and Lacan do not merit distinction. Their supposed differences are insignificant since they ultimately operate in the same way, and it is this fact that the Lacanian thesis that desire is constituted by law makes legible. There is thus no reason for Foucault not to lump together all the negations psychoanalysis deploys, since they all accomplish the same task, saying no, in saying no to or positing limits on sex. The repetition of this reproach, that juridical discursive power operates monotonously through the single mechanism of saying no, has by now become such a lulling refrain that one almost fails to notice the new proposal that follows. If psychoanalysis, which now also includes the Lacanian form, epitomizes the functioning of juridical discursive power, it is because it highlights the fact that this form misconstrues power's power as poor, as insufficiently resourceful. Underlying both the general theme that power represses sex and the idea that the law constitutes desire, one encounters the same putative mechanism of power, which define power in a strangely restrictive way as poor in resources. We may think this point has already been made, but it hasn't quite. The allusion to the poverty of resources follows and is directly connected to the introduction of the term juridical discursive. We have heard the juridical part of the argument. What is new is the discursive part, which Foucault now fuses to his earlier argument. In other words, the impoverished resources are now attributed particularly to language. On some level, this is not a surprising claim, insofar as everyone knows that unfurled, the Foucauldian banner reads, "No language but power." Moreover, language has not been completely missing from the critique of the plain juridical model, which was condemned for restricting itself to saying no. And we have understood what Foucault means by this. In saying no to something, we say it, we name it, in an utterance, and this saying implants in us a desire we might not otherwise have had. Tell a child not to touch something hot, and the minute your back is turned, you can expect to hear a squeal of pain. Draw up a list of thou shalt nots, 10 or however many you choose, and you can be sure that they will become the chapter and verse of our transactions at every moment of our life. Interdiction is a kind of saying. But Foucault is now arguing that the obverse is also true. Affirmation through putting into language, saying as such, is also a kind of interdiction. The only difference between the negative notion of power and this constitutive one is that the first encourages the false hope of liberation, while the second admits the truth outright. You are always already trapped. The history of sexuality indicts Lacan's linguistic return to Freud as a recreation of the founder's negative repressive hypothesis, as the reinstatement of a law of subjectivity. Language is what essentially dictates its law to sex, which means that sex is placed, I'm quoting Foucault, language is what essentially dictates its law to sex, which means that law is placed by language in a binary system. Licit, illicit, language, licit, illicit. Language constitutes sex as a form of intelligibility and casts the pleasure of bodies into the realm not simply of unintelligibility, but more into oblivion in existence. One must not talk about what is forbidden until it is annulled in reality. What is inexistent has no right to show itself, even in the order of speech, where its inexistence is declared. That's still Foucault. Mockingly, Foucault draws up 7 commandments of Lacanian psychoanalysis. Thou shalt not go near, thou shalt not touch, thou shalt not consume, thou shalt not experience pleasure, thou shalt not speak, thou shalt not show thyself, thou shalt not exist except in darkness and secrecy. Lacan is guilty then of reinforcing or radicalizing Freudian negation by making it bear on existence itself. If to affirm is to make exist, not saying something amounts to denying it exists. The radicality of another kind of negation seems to beckon for attention, but Foucault ignores it. The unsayable is quickly folded back into the logic of prohibition. The result of this folding back is that the distinction between existence and inexistence is assimilated to the barriers between the licit and the illicit and so on. That form the binaries which law, including the law of language, dominates. Defining the barrier, law reigns over both sides of it. It is time to cease berating Foucault, both for his unapologetic conflation of various forms of negation and for his characterization of language's resources as limited and limiting. Let us instead begin to respond to the charges by demonstrating the ways in which psychoanalysis articulates a way out of the impasses into which theorizing power, law, and language have often led us. We will need to restart the discussion from the place where we first spied a fork in the road, precisely in the Freudian assertion that some obstacle is necessary to heighten libido. Refusing to see the obstacle as a lure fabricated by the conflated entity, repression, prohibition, censorship, Foucault constantly says no difference, they're all the same, then how do we see it? I attempted elsewhere to cast Foucault's interpretation of the repressive hypothesis into doubt by citing the Freudian distinction between the repression of ideas and the displacement of affect, but failed to develop my counter-proposal very far. The context from which I took this distinction is significant. The precise formulation I cited came not directly from Freud, but from an address by Lacan to students who were voicing discontent with their overly intellectualized, overly abstract university education, which in the face of global issues then unfolding seemed irrelevant. Lacan responded that if he felt he was in a good position to answer these students' concern, it was because Freud had led the way when he was obliged in his day to answer similar complaints about the intellectualization of the analytic process on the one hand and the maintenance of the repressed on the other. Lacan states that Freud's response, which supported itself directly on a formulation of the concept of negation, Verneinung, is what ultimately gave psychoanalysis the weight necessary to stand up to the misgivings concerning its consequentiality, that is, to its real-world effectiveness. The reference to negation is what introduces and accounts for the distinction I mentioned a moment ago. Although ideas can be repressed, Freud explicitly stated that affect is not repressed. Affect is effectively displaced, unidentified, broken off from the roots. It eludes us. Pivotal for the claim that the resources of language in psychoanalysis are robust and enable both to intervene in the world, the concept of Verneinung will have to be spelled out. A couple of preliminary points will help flag and thus hold firmly in mind the stakes involved. One, that the absence of any mention of affect from Foucault's account of the Freudian theory of sexuality did not ignite the outrage of readers, only confirms the message Lacan was attempting to get across. Those who were blinded by his emphasis on the linguistic dimension of psychoanalysis from perceiving any evidence of affect there were surely laboring under a distorted notion of affect as independent of language. For Freud and Lacan, on the other hand, affect is unapproachable except by a language. This means that the direct access to bodies and pleasures Foucault hoped to achieve could only remain a pre-critical pipe dream. By setting out to bypass language, one loses affect, which is cited in the body, Two, the impasse in which Foucault found himself makes plain the roadblocks we have to clear. The problem, well acknowledged, was his inability to conceive an outside of power, even as he accused psychoanalysis of perpetrating this very crime by tethering every resistance to the short leash of law. In the juridical discursive model, power just is this tethering of outside to inside, is the very guarantee of their articulation. Every resistance remains under the jurisdiction of power. Opposing this model, Foucault sees no other way out than to deny power an inside. Since power, in its productive rather than negative capacity, is endlessly ramifying, without boundaries, we need not fear the prison doors of power closing around us. Yet any relief this assurance might bring will be short-lived, for it is also immediately apparent that without boundaries or doors, there are no exits from power. No way then to limit or radically alter the course of power. In the concept of Fernando, we are hoping to find a way of relating language and affect and an outside that does not revert back to power. To be fair, Foucault does admit that a more radical notion of negation than the prohibition, interdiction, censorship variety he mainly deals with it is invoked in the Lacanian version of psychoanalysis, at least, in the Lacanian version of psychoanalysis at least. But he brushes off its claim to radicality without examining it. There are actually two more radical forms of negation that will concern us here, and they were introduced by Freud before Lacan was driven to uncover them from neglect. First one is the foreclosure, and then the Fernando negation. We will deal primarily with the second, which is the subject of Freud's brilliant essay, Negation, a reading of Freud's essay. Neither of these is subject to the dynamic force of repression that enables the famous return of the repressed to consciousness. The negations proper to foreclosure and negation bear not on a particular prohibited act or object, but on being itself. If indeed this fact is alluded to, it is badly caricatured in Foucault's claim that Lacan's constitutive notion of desire denies existence to particular acts or objects. Denies is weak. Foucault intends it to be. He prefers to underestimate the boldness of the Freudian hypothesis, which posits that there is from the very beginning a primal deduction, a radical expulsion of being by language. Something is expunged from psychic life. Psychic life does not simply suffer this loss, it is founded on it. From here on out, nothing exists except against a supposed background of absence. From the moment she is born, the subject is denaturalized and objects no longer appear to her in their immediacy. This thesis is manifest in various ways in Freud, but we see it most clearly in his positing of one primary lost object, the mother, or das Ding, the thing, as Freud refers to it in the project for scientific psychology. The prohibition of incest operates in psychoanalysis at this level of irrecoverable loss. Prohibition is therefore unfortunate in terms of the argument Freud develops, for it invites confusion with its false friend, prohibition, as in saying no to or forbidding something, as in all the thou shalt nots of the commandments, whether they the biblical 10 or the Foucauldian 7. Foucault clearly falls prey to this confusion when he speaks about incest in the history of psychoanalysis, where he makes it so, its so-called prohibition the paragon of prohibition, the naysaying rule of rules, occupying the supposed threshold of all cultures, societies, and individuals. In reality, he contests, this prohibition functions merely to consolidate a particular historical form, the bourgeois family, which emerged at a specific moment as a hotbed of forbidden desires, which family members were incited to examine and confess. By devoting so much effort to the transcultural theory of incest, anthropology proved worthy of the whole modern deployment of sexuality. Foucault. The reference to anthropology is designed to ring the bell of truth, immediately to call to mind Levi-Strauss and the complaints against structuralism then being voiced. Levi-Strauss secured his structural anthropology, Foucault intimates, less on the study of particular cultures than on the supposedly universal, but in reality quite parochial claim that culture as such is founded on the taboo against incest. It should be noted that the psychoanalytic concept of the incest taboo differs from Levi-Strauss's, which bears only on the relation between fathers and daughters, on the hoarding of women, and even more significantly from Foucault's, which concerns the affective intensification of all the relations among family members. By way of separating culture from nature, accounting for the emergence of culture, Freud focuses exclusively on the incestuous desire for the mother, but nowhere claims that this desire follows from a prohibition of the mother. Not even in the Ten Commandments is it specified that one must not sleep with one's mother, Lacan points out, believing this might offer some confirmation of Freud's theoretical discovery. What is at work in the founding of culture is something stronger than a prohibition of the mother. The mother, or a dimension of her, is quite simply deducted, subtracted. That is, the natural relation to nature, she implies, is lost to speaking beings. Thus, contrary to Foucault's complaint that the repressive hypothesis attains its highest form in the incest taboo, which sets itself up as the unvarying law of all cultures and thus resists the form it may take, restricts the form it may take, Freud's deduction hypothesis subtracts the natural ground of cultures. Rather than restrict the form cultures may take, this subtraction makes it impossible to posit a necessary relation between nature and culture. It cuts the link between them. Yet there is no avoiding the fact that this last statement runs into a different kind of trouble. It threatens to succumb to the charge of idealism. This is where Fernando comes in. To students grumbling about the ineffectiveness of mere intellection and Foucault's charge that psychoanalysis incites sex in an order that operates as a form of mere intelligibility, Fernando remains prepared to give an answer, even while it gives the opposite impression. A crucial point of Freud's essay is that even if analysis sometimes succeeds in bringing about a full intellectual acceptance of the repressed, the repressive process itself will not be removed. Now, is this ineffectiveness of the intellectual acceptance brought forth by analysis not the very criticism, as per Lacan's claim quoted earlier, against which psychoanalysis had to defend itself? Does not this failure to remove the repression condemn psychoanalysis for putting too much stock in its poor resource, language? At the opening of the essay, Negation, the patient blurts out the following. You ask, who is this person in the dream? Who this person in the dream can be. It's not my mother. But Freud continues, we amend this to, so it is his mother. In our interpretation, we take the liberty of disregarding the negation. This little scene seems to set psychoanalysis up as the butt of jokes. Not only are analysts lacking in effectiveness, they are also arbitrary in their interpretation. Take care, however, precipitous criticism will fail most miserably here. That the patient's repression is not eliminated but persists does not invalidate Freud's, keep it coming, does not invalidate Freud's insistence that an analyst is licensed to count the patient's negation as affirmation. Why? Because psychoanalysis does not conceive repression as entirely reducible and does not seek, therefore, simply to abolish it. As we have noted, we pay a ransom for our access to language. Something is deducted permanently from what can be said. It is as if something were, from the beginning, subtracted from experience, as if every speaking subject were subject to a pure or lost past that was never present, never experienced. To this extent, we can agree with Foucault when he insists, in his charge against psychoanalysis, that language does not simply affirm, make intelligible, but also negate, casts into oblivion, into inexistence. Language, it is true, denies existence. For this very reason, the analyst who reads Freud's negation as affirmation does not demonstrate pure arbitrariness, our capacity to say whatever we want. You say no, I say yes, without putting anything at stake. She acknowledges rather that there is something that's impossible to say, and this has undeniable consequences for understanding psychic functioning. The patient's blurted out denial, it's not my mother, negates a prior negation, the one that casts the mother into inexistence, into an irretrievable lost path. The patient's denial does not negate that first, does not negate that first negation, does not lift the repression in this sense. The mother remains under the pall of repression, inexistent, and yet, in proper Hegelian fashion, the negation of the negation is not for naught. For the primordially lost mother is lifted up in all her inexistence, and it is this inexistence of which the patient thus becomes cognizant. Now I am arguing that Freud's theory of negation finds absolutely no place in Foucault's account of psychoanalysis, as reliant primarily on a repressive hypothesis that serves only to ensnare subjects in power by inciting them to transgress limits and obstacles that are only too ready to give way. But I am also suggesting that had he not been so blind with respect to psychoanalysis, he might not have been left begging at the end of the history of sexuality for another theory of the body and its pleasures. What he calls the repressive hypothesis, not as he articulates it, but as it is articulated by Freud in the negation essay and elsewhere, just may be what Foucault was looking for. There is an obstacle, a limit at work there, which is a resource, not of power, but of language. This limit is put in place by the symbol of negation and acts to impede the instinct of negation, which ejects, throws outside, represses anything that is foreign to the ego. One is reminded of the commandments Foucault incorrectly ascribes to Lacan's linguistically inflected approach to psychoanalysis. Thou shalt not go near, touch, consume, speak, and so on. These commandments, issued by the pleasure ego and enforced by the destructive instinct, are muffled, not uttered, by the symbol of negation. To what end? Freud's essay implicitly dispels the once upon a time myth that in the beginning there was an inside that only later became breached or open to an outside. Freud suggests, however, that at the beginning there is not something, but that there is division of the inside, which is affirmed, and the outside, which is negated or expelled. But Hippolyte notices that this division is not as symmetrical as it first appears. For while affirmation is synonymous with a taking in or introjection, negation is designated by Freud as a consequence of an expulsion. It follows after and resists the compulsive destruction, holds up the discharge. It is significant. This is significant because it means that the psyche is not dominated by opposing forces of affirmation and negation. Symbolic negation acts as a resisting force on the primary force of negation. This argument, can carefully considered, exposes Foucault's claim that psychoanalysis submits sex to a binary system that separates the licit and illicit and the intelligibility of sex from the unintelligibility of bodily pleasures. It exposes this as mistaken at its core. We said from the start that sexuality escapes rather than abides by these divisions, but that point is nowhere more clear than in this particular argument about negation. Listen a little longer to how it goes. After making the point that negation neither recognizes the repressed nor renders it intelligible, but only ceases to deny it, Freud writes, we can see how, in this, the intellectual function is separated from the affective function. But it is clear written in my hotel room. But it is clear that that more than separation, Freud has in fact revealed their crucial entanglements. It is clear, or I'm trying to insert a phrase that it's clear where. It's clear particularly in the ego and the id, which is written around the same time as the negation essay. For as he himself argues in the ego and the id, negation operates on the unconscious compulsive force of repression to bring something into consciousness as unpleasure. That is, the intellectual function, negation, alters an unconscious affect by bringing to consciousness something, and Freud puts it in quotes, which is unable to indicate, puts this in quotes in order to indicate that what emerges is foreign to consciousness, which is unable to transcend it. The conscious affect that replaces the unconscious one is characterized as unpleasurable, therefore, not in reference to the destructive force from which it was derived, but in reference to the discomfort this alterity creates for the ego. The ego's displeasure, it's being unsettled by an awareness of a wider economy than the one over which it pretends to rule, one that escapes the ego under its own power. It is this alterity that nevertheless becomes a resource for thought, the margin that gives it something other to think. The negation essay develops the argument of the ego and the id, and makes more sense of the distinction between conscious, unconscious, and conscious affect. Affect, as we commonly think of it, can only be thought against the backdrop of a force that negates and which it, that is affect, replaces. And at the moment, I'm not able, this became interesting to me in thinking of the problem, and I would like to write about this, but I'm going to have to stop. I can't do that here. But that's what I would have done if I gave it an additional page extra. For the moment, I want to pull a veil over my own impasse because I haven't thought this through, and therefore to close my by redirecting your attention away from my impasse to the warning Lacan issues at the beginning of his reading of Freud's negation essay, in which he tells us not to confuse Freud's notion of affect with the use made of this term by the new psychoanalysis, which raises it as a psychological qualitas occulta to designate that lived experience whose subtle gold was decanted through a high alchemy. The concept of affect that emerges in Freud is certainly that of an immediacy at which we could arrive by leaping out of language into some beyond. Affect is rather the power of the phenomenon of exposure from within language and by means of language to what is outside it. It is the speaking subject that suffers affect. I can't claim really to know what Foucault was looking for at the end of the history of sexuality, when he calls for a different conception of bodies and their pleasures, or what he means when he claims that power works directly on the body without passing through ideology. But I believe I am right in being suspicious about his position.
Thank you very much indeed. If I keep the water coming, would you take some questions? Time for discussion.
Is a microphone on the table, or?
Sorry.
Hi, I have well, thank you for the insightful lecture, thought-provoking lecture. I just had a simple question, actually. I was wondering whether if Lacan ever pronounces the name of Foucault, and whether we have an idea of what he thought of Foucault's project on sexuality in particular, but on power more largely. Thanks.
I know he responded to Foucault's reading of Las Meninas. That's what is it?
It's in Seminar 13. Seminar 13, it's in Object for Psychoanalysis.
That he read the painting differently, and I think Foucault was in the audience when Lacan gave that reading. Then the question becomes, what did Foucault respond? And I don't know if we know that to Lacan's reading, but that's the only time I'm aware of. I know that there was a confrontation. Some Lacanian, I think Badiou at least Badiou and Miller at one point confronted Foucault. And I think that's even on tape somewhere, if one could find it. But
thank you very much, Joe. This was great. Actually, it's not a question, it's more kind of something that I thought of when you were talking about the question of the, let me put it this way, when at some point Lacan makes this crucial remark that what caused the hugest scandal in Freudian theory of the unconscious was actually its being so intellectual, not its being so dirty, but precisely the intellectual part of it. This was what was supposedly, this is how he saw the things, most unacceptable, that it made all these puns and stuff and that worked in a way, including Verneinung, in these things, which precisely goes, I think, in the direction of what you said, that there is something of an intellectual function which is not reducible to the intellect or to rationality as opposed to whatever the unconscious, which supposedly escapes this. But it is precisely the kind of inner craziness of the intellectual function itself that was kind of strange or didn't fall into the classical image of psychoanalysis as introducing, forcing us to confront also the dirty, repressed things as opposed to these high functions of reason. And I think this was probably right, he was probably very right when he made this kind of diagnosis. It's just
yeah, I mean the difference, well, that's true in his metapsychology, but it's also even when he was analyzing patients, when, getting down to the dirty details, it's still, intellectual, quite intellectual.
I was thinking, I wonder if I could rephrase part of the argument of your paper in the following way. It seems like Foucault in History of Sexuality, when he talks about repression, he's always talking about secondary repression. It's secondary repression, but he doesn't have a theory of primary repression. Or he explicitly rejects the notion of, he would say it's a kind of theoretical folly. The idea of a primal repression would just be a sort of ontologization of an empirical. But then, what confuses me, is that if you go back to the order of things, then Foucault says, and without reconstructing a very complex argument, but essentially he says that psychoanalysis has a special access to the transcendental level. Well, let me back up. I was struck by actually one line of yours when you were saying psychic life doesn't suffer from this loss, but it's founded on this loss. So it's as if the loss, the primary repression, is a kind of transcendental, if we can put it back into philosophical terms. And then, so Foucault seems to have a place for that in the order of things, where he says psychoanalysis can actually give us access to the transcendental conditions for the constitution of the object of the other human sciences, but it can only do that because it doesn't make that into a new positive knowledge. It's only accessible via the singular practice of analysis in the transference, as Mellon talked about this morning. So it seems like Foucault could have situated repression there. The repression has a kind of transcendental signification in psychoanalysis in that work in 66, but when he comes in 76, repression is simply a secondary or an empirical operation. That's my confusion. Like, why doesn't he see that anymore? Why doesn't he care? Or what? Yeah.
That's my general confusion about Foucault, and the question that he has to ask certain questions and he doesn't, and he knows things that he conveniently forgets. For the essay that was mentioned, where he says the next century will be Deleuzian, is really the Deleuzian texts that he cites are Deleuze's most Lacanian texts. Difference in repetition and logic of sense, and he takes up Deleuze's notions for a theory of historicity. He has to have Foucault has to have a theory of historicity, and he accepts all of what Deleuze says. So that's why I don't understand why he remains blind to comparable. Even that notion, the notion of the object A, basically, which Deleuze takes on board, and Foucault takes on board as long as Deleuze says it. But it seems impossible for him to think otherwise. I can't.
Sorry. Well, thank you very much. That was great. I will just add to the remark that was made before, whether Lacan engages with Foucault. That there was a confrontation actually in 1967 when Foucault gave the lecture Qu'est-ce qu'un auteur, what is an author, for the French Philosophical Society. Lacan was in the audience and he immediately engaged in the whole thing. Otherwise, there was the big engagement also with Le Jeu de Michel Foucault. The Orlicard invited Foucault after the publication of History of Sexuality. Miller and the whole bunch was there, and they really gave him a hard time. So this is one of the famous.
That is, but it's either it exists as a text, or I saw it on video. But I know, that it's. I've read the whole confrontation, or saw the whole confrontation. I don't remember. But
yes, well, there was respect from both sides because the guys were mostly his students or his previous students, so they had enormous respect for him. And the epistemological circle which posed the questions to Foucault, from which the archaeology of knowledge emerged, they were the same guys. So there was a lot of respect, but there was a lot of blood in that.
And do you know how it happened that Foucault was at the lecture when she blossomed in Venus? He had to have been told that it was coming to be present. I'm sure he didn't go to all of Lacan's lectures.
I would just like to add some things. You mentioned the question of variety of negations in psychoanalysis, and you took up basically Verneinung as a sort of one model of negation. And at one point I tried to make a list of Freudian negations, and they are actually 6. There is Verneinung, there is Verschiebung, which is a displacement, Verdichtung, which is a condensation, Verdrängung, which is repression, there is Verwerfung, which is foreclosure, and Verleugnung, which is disavowal. So there is a whole list of various modalities of negation in Freud. And what all these words have in common is this particle Ver, which in German means a deviation. A deviation, a straying away. So this is very interesting. Verneinung, Verleugnung, Verschiebung, all these words. There is a negation at stake, but it's a deviated negation. It's a deviated negation. It's a negation which doesn't properly negate its object, but actually helps to create the object which is at stake. And 3 of those things, foreclosure, repression, and disavowal, are actually the types of negation which lie at the bottom of the 3 basic clinical structures of neurosis, psychosis, and perversion. So what Freud sees, this is a Freudian clinic, what Freud sees as the basic types in which every kind of human pathology is described in one way or another, is based on 3 different kinds of negation. So there is a very complex theory of negation at stake in Freud. It is very interesting how to disentangle it. And all this negation is premised on something that Freud writes about quite a few times, the absence of no in dreams. There is all this negation which is premised on the fact that there is the dreams know no. There's no in dreams.
Because they're in the opposite.
And this is precisely, all these negations are as if a stand-in for the impossibility of knowing the unconscious. So, okay, I just want to somehow expand your argument that there is if you take up seriously the question of negation in Freud, you come with a very, very complex picture.
Yeah, one could have gone, but I think one is enough to make the point. But it's striking because Foucault is brazen about this. I mean, he says, it sounds like I'm mixing up words. I am, because I don't think that there's any difference. That's surprising. That's astounding.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. That was great.
I wanted to actually go back to the first part of your paper, where you mentioned clearly like Freud's great disappointment and crusade against Jung and Adler. But don't you think that in a sense this sort of mitigates, to go back to Aaron's question, this non sequitur between 66 and the interest that Foucault shows for Lacan, and then this kind of very, at the end of the day, I think, at least as Lacanians, we agree, naive attack on psychoanalysis as such. Don't you think that actually what you said about the deviationist Freudian sort of mitigates Foucault's fault in the sense of what Mellon was saying in the morning, that is to say that in a way maybe the objective there of the polemics is actually a certain doxa. And of course, he was very close to the same, Foucault was very close to the same cultural milieu as Lacan in Paris, but let's not forget that in the 70s, actually, mainstream Freudianism is not Lacanianism worldwide. So I'm just trying to play the, of course, I very much sympathize with your no Foucault, but at the same time, maybe there is a certain psychoanalytical contribution to Foucault's own problematic critique of psychoanalysis.
Yeah, I mean, so that his critique is not really original critique, but borrowed one, or yeah, borrowed from the doxa. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So it wasn't. It's not even. That's a further criticism. Not even a. Yes. Even the criticism is not original. Jody.
I liked the paper very much. I thought it was great. But my question is, so if there's 6 different kinds of negation, as Laden mentioned, which one is yours in no Foucault, right?
It's not one of those.
It's not one of those. So, because it actually seems like the, yeah, okay, so which one?
It was the one in Beirut, is the one I focused on, but I was, at one point the title was No Foucault. To indicate the multiplicities of no's that could have been discussed, but you know, I didn't want it to seem like I was too frivolous. No, I mean, just a sharp no.
Thank you for this paper. I wanted to ask a question that sort of asks you to take what you're saying to the political. And so, if part of the difficulty that Foucault has is thinking dyadic relations, right? And so there's a sense in which he can't, you know, when Freud talks about in the essay on Finito, he suggests that the analyst might want to ask some questions like, what's the furthest thing from your mind? And then, you know, because the point of this kind of negation is that it's happening in the context of a transference. That, I mean, you know this, but if that's what's at stake in transference, it's at stake in the context of like a dynamic psychic interchange that's transformative. And there's a sense in which Foucault just takes it as though it's kind of an epistemological question, right? The repressive hypothesis is just, what is the world? Okay, well, you know, we discover it's this, and we discover it's that, and we discover it's the other thing. And in the context of psychoanalysis, it's a clinical question. It's not what is the world, but how does the transformation of the subject happen in the context of the transference? Is there a way in which what Foucault is missing from a Lacanian version of negation gets us something that Foucauldian sort of analytics can't get us at the level of organization? I mean, I know that's not what you're talking about. I'm just kind of wanting to ask you to push it towards the political a little bit, if you're willing.
I would like to and I don't think that in this case it has to do with the transference. The fact that I accept that, you know, in this case that it looks like looks ridiculous at first, and until you understand the theory, and it shouldn't. But it's distinct from times when analysts do give arbitrary and, you know, insist The question of arbitrariness is important for psychoanalysis and its practice. In this case, I don't think it is arbitrary, and I also don't think it's dependent. Well, it's a little bit dependent because you're going to think, or when there's an address to the animus at the same time. But I think it's a kind of a more metapsychological question that is raised here. The political question. I can't immediately, transform this into that. Maybe eventually.
Any further questions? No? Okay.
Yeah, I think so. We'll thank Professor Kopchak once again for